Just to let folks know that we haven't officially launched the webinar yet. We're just going to give a little time as participants join us. So you haven't missed anything yet. And again, for folks that are just coming in, we're simply waiting a little while before we start the proceedings in order to allow participants to join in and not miss anything.
Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Mon nom est Hamid Karzai et au nom du groupe de réflexion sur le Moyen-Orient, c'est un grand plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cet événement spécial qui a été organisé en collaboration avec le groupe de réflexion sur le renseignement et la sécurité. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, the traditional territory of the Wendat and Haudenosaunee Confederacy. May we honor the indigenous stewards of this land and grow in right relationship with all indigenous peoples. At this time, I would like to thank my colleague, Ms. Valerie Spencer-Keys, Chair of the Security and Intelligence Study Group, and her colleagues for their collaboration and generous support. Now, allow me to introduce our distinguished moderator, who will be subsequently introducing our speakers. Madam Peggy Mason is a former Canadian ambassador for disarmament to the UN and an expert on the political diplomatic aspects of UN peacekeeping training. Since June of 2014, Ms. Mason has been the president of the Rideau Institute, an independent, not-for-profit think tank focusing on research and advocacy in foreign, defense, and national security policy. In that capacity, she has brought a progressive voice to issues ranging from the imperative of nuclear disarmament to centrality of UN conflict resolution and the progressive enhancement of international law. Madam Mason, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very, very much for that introduction, Hamid. It occurred to me rather belatedly that when I gave you my short bio, I should probably have included the fact that in 1992-93, while I was ambassador for disarmament to the UN, I chaired a UN expert study on verification that looked in great detail at the work of the UN Special Commission, UNSCOM, in Iraq, as well as the IAEA verification regarding the nuclear dimension. After the first Iraq War, or the Gulf War as it was known, those were the verification mechanisms to make sure that any weapons of mass destruction capacity that Iraq had would be dismantled. I also testified before our Foreign Affairs Committee on the illegality of an attack on Iraq without UN Security Council authorization in circumstances where there was no imminent threat to the USA, because the work of UNSCOM and the IAEA had conclusively established that Iraq, which had been under continuous sanctions and IAEA, that's International Atomic Energy Agency monitoring, and coercive disarmament since the end of the war, had not reconstituted, had not been able to reconstitute any of its WMD programs. So I come at this with a particular interest, and another relevant point from Canada's perspective is the fact that after the fact, when the then Prime Minister Chrétien was asked why Canada did not support the United States in the invasion of Iraq, and there's a superb National Film Board documentary on this called High Wire. Prime Minister Chrétien refers in particular to his reliance on a Canadian intelligence assessments, not American. I raise that because I wonder whether or not I wonder how much that situation has arguably fundamentally changed since September 11th and the revelation of Canadian officials deferring to American counterparts with disastrous results for Canadian citizens. And of course, Mayor Arar comes to mind. One more comment about the Canadian angle, fodder for our speakers, who I'm sure will have lots to say on them, is in terms of the broader discussion and not just Iraq, because that's the backdrop, is the July 2020 ruling of our federal court about, quote, the cavalier approach, unquote, of our security intelligence agency to the rule of law. So with those comments to fire us up, I hope, I turn briefly to the broader background, and that is that the 20th anniversary, we're nearing the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq based on faulty and indeed misleading intelligence about Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction. And of course, since then, there have been a litany of other intelligence failures, just to name two: the September 11th attacks and the 6th January 2021 insurrection, which raise profound questions about the soundness not only of the intelligence, but of the interface between the intelligence apparatus and the political decision makers, who are themselves subject to many influences, with a view to better understanding the process of sound intelligence analysis and policy creation and the obstacles to that. Because one can have very, very good intelligence and very good analysis of that intelligence, but what if it's distorted in the policy creation process? We have two very experienced speakers to lead us in this exploration. Dr. Chris Kilford is a member of the National Board of the Canadian International Council, is president of the Canadian International Council Victoria branch. He holds a PhD in history from Queen's University with a focus on civil-military relations in the developing world. He is currently a fellow with the Queen's Centre for International Defence Policy, a sessional instructor at the Royal Military College of Canada and the Canadian Forces College, where he teaches online geopolitical and history courses, and he is an adjunct faculty member at Royal Roads University. Prior to that, he had a 36-year career in the Canadian Forces, retiring in late 2014. His military career included a position as military liaison with the Senate Committee on National Security and Defense and military attaché positions in Afghanistan, Turkey, and elsewhere. His book chapters, articles, and opinion pieces on Canadian defense and foreign policy issues and Turkish and Middle Eastern matters have appeared in many Canadian and international publications. Our second speaker, well, actually, he will speak first, but in terms of introductions, Colonel retired Frank Sobchak has taught, PhD, has taught at the US Military Academy at West Point, Tufts University, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He holds a degree in military history from West Point, an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University, and a PhD in international relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. So stopping right there and just noting that both of our speakers have this background of both military, solid military background, but also diplomatic and geographic expertise. The final assignment of Dr. Sobchak's 26-year career in the US Army included leading the Army effort to publish an official history of the Iraq War. That effort spanned 5 years, included the declassification of over 30,000 pages of documents, not to mention review of classified materials, and culminated with the publication of the 1,500-page 2-volume set, The U.S. Army in the Iraq War. Dr. Sobchak has been a frequent contributor to television, radio, and print interviews for topics such as Middle East security, defense reform, civil military relations, and Special Operations Forces. He is a fellow at the Miriam Institute and has published in Newsweek, Time, the Wall Street Journal, the Jerusalem Post, among others. So two very experienced speakers to tackle and give us their perspectives on a challenging and broad-ranging topic. Regarding the process we're going to follow, each speaker will have 15 minutes with Dr. Sobchak first and Dr. Kilford second. And then we're going to turn to question time. I might, depending on how we're doing with our time, throw in a question to lead us off. And then we turn, as I said, to questions from the audience. Now, just on that point, would audience members please use the chat function and type your question into the chat, and then I will try to do my best to keep track of them. And then you can either indicate in your question, if you want to, which speaker, or I can do the fielding of those questions for the speakers. And both speakers should feel free, even if the question was directed at one, to jump in if they have something to say. Okay.
Just a correction, we will make a Q&A button available to participants.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Hamid. I had, I had concern about the chat on my brain, and then I said for everyone to use it, but no, it's the Q&A function, the only function that everyone should be using and may in fact only be able to use, and it makes sense for questions. Please use the Q&A function. And I'll mention that again when we get to questions. Okay, not wanting to lose any more time, and without delay, I would like to turn to our first speaker, Dr. Frank Sobchak.
Ambassador Mason, thank you for such a very warm welcome. It is great to be back with CIC, and I'm very honored to be here. So for today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of talk about three things. First, I'll give you a little bit about my background and my kind of experience with Iraq, with intelligence. So that way, if you want to explore that in the question and answer period, that's kind of an option. Second, since we are nearing the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War, what I'll do is I'll cover the kind of a general structure of the U.S. intelligence community. And then I'll try to give my kind of perceptions on why things went so wrong, why there was such a tremendous intelligence failure on the part of the U.S. and U.S. intelligence community on the topic of weapons of mass destruction and on the connection of Iraq to the 9/11 terrorists, which obviously there was none in either case. So first of all, to just give you a little bit about my background, I started as a military intelligence officer in the U.S. Army. Obviously, yes, it is an oxymoron. And I spent 4 years doing that. Most of my time there was at the tactical level, so I was very much kind of on the ground, dealing with human intelligence kind of sources, also ground surveillance, radars, and other things. At the 4-year point, I went to Special Forces Assessment and Selection, which is kind of colloquially known as the Green Berets. Our actually regimental history goes back to the U.S. and Canadian first Special Service Force, so we have very deep ties with Canada. And I finished the rest of my career in Special Forces. There, again, I specialized in human intelligence. And in 2005, during my deployment to Iraq, I was in Nineveh province in Mosul. We were both advising the Iraqi military and running human sources and contacts. Following that assignment, I was selected to be a liaison between U.S. Special Operations Command, which is kind of our higher level headquarters, our strategic level headquarters, that encompasses all of the different components, whether it be Air Force Special Operations, the SEALs, and Naval Special Warfare Command, and then all of the Army components, and U.S. Congress. And I did that for 4 years, and it was a very interesting time period because it was very much at the strategic level. And in many ways, the opponent that I spent most of my time fighting, figuratively and not actually. Although I do sometimes wonder if the CIA ever actually tried to put out a hit on me, but maybe not, was with the CIA. consistently, and you'll, as I start going into my discussion of kind of the construct of the U.S. intelligence system, this is kind of one of the core challenges, is that there are so many different intelligence agencies. In our case, we were constantly fighting with the CIA over authorities, with the Armed Services Committee and the Intelligence Committee on what we were authorized to do, what we were not authorized by U.S. law to authorities, what we were allowed to perform. And in many cases, the CIA perceived that the Armed Services Committees had moved the line too far and that we were encouraging on their turf or impeding on their equities. And they were constantly trying to fight to push that back. And I spent a lot of time doing that. Well, obviously, as Ambassador Mason said, the last couple of years of my tenure, I was very fortunate to be one of the primary authors and eventually lead the team that wrote the operational level history of the Iraq War. We interviewed everyone from President Bush to Condoleezza Rice to all of the four-star commanders in Iraq, and many the Iraqi generals who commanded Iraqi army units during Saddam's time. So it was a great experience, and that helped inform kind of my background. So that said, what I'll talk about next briefly is the notion of the U.S. intelligence community. And in many ways, the U.S. has been uncomfortable with kind of the notion of intelligence over its past. And this created to how the intelligence community was formed. And in fact, prior to World War I, the U.S. did not have a civilian intelligence agency. There was intelligence components within the Army and within the Navy, but there was no civilian intelligence organization. And post-World War I, there were efforts to kind of remedy this. And there was a cipher bureau that was created within the U.S. Department of State, ominously titled the Black Chamber, kind of in reference to British historical spy agencies that would kind of showing a U.S. predilection towards signals intelligence that would decipher encrypted cables. This lasted only 10 years. And in 1929, it was shut down by the U.S. Secretary of State, Henry Simpson, who very famously quipped, "Gentlemen do not read each other's mail." And so at the beginning of World War II, the U.S. went into World War II without a civilian spy agency. And it was only at the behest of the British, and again, always blame the British, and Winston Churchill urging FDR to stand up an MI6 style organization, that in September 1942, the US finally stood up the Office of Strategic Services, which in many ways was a hybrid of kind of paramilitary special operations, kind of links to the, and parallels to the British Special Operations Executive, but also links to the Central Intelligence Agency, or the future Central Intelligence Agency that would perform civilian intelligence collection, espionage, and analysis. That organization was disbanded within weeks of the end of World War II. However, kind of everything changed with the advent of the Cold War, and then the September 11th and the post 9/11 wars. And that US predilection, to not really do business within the intelligence world completely went out the window, and we dove headfirst into it and tried to craft an intelligence community kind of out of what we had. And so as much as I despise Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who's really one of the main instigators of the Iraq War, one of the things that he said really stands out, and it applies to the intelligence community. He said, and I might paraphrase slightly here, that you go to war with the army that you have, not with the army that you wish to have. And in many cases, that's what we had in terms of the intelligence community, because we went to war with the intelligence community that we had, and not the one that we wish to have. And because the US had had such a resistance or reluctance to kind of have intelligence as a kind of a national body for so long, what had developed instead was each one of the different US bureaus or departments crafted their own internal intelligence bureau. And so that in 2003, when the US intelligence community was making decisions on whether to go to war or not, or making recommendations to policymakers, the US had no less than 15 different members of the intelligence community, spread across very disparate organizations, everything from the FBI, Drug Enforcement Agency, State Department, Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, Energy, and Treasury all had different intelligence bureaus. And that, in some ways, contributed to the failures that we had in the intelligence failures prior to the Iraq War. Because, kind of shifting to that component of the talk, in many ways, as I see it, they're what I would phrase as failures that are not nefarious. There was organizational and just human failures, just kind of as heuristics and decision-making problems that we have as human beings, as well as some semi-nefarious or borderline nefarious, depending on how you see it, components of the failure. And so I'll kind of talk about each of them. The majority of them, in my opinion, are the non-nefarious side and are just organizational challenges. And so one of those was simply that fact that there were 15 different intelligence agencies without any really overarching or supervisory force to kind of herd the cats. And this was one of the findings of the September 11th Commission that eventually led to the creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Theoretically, one individual and one organization that would take all of the disparate intelligence from the various intelligence agencies and organizations, feed it all into one, kind of location, and then be able to provide the best intelligence based on all of that. And, part of that, really the September 11th, the investigations, had revealed, the commissions had revealed that bits and pieces of the intelligence was all out there. The FBI knew that there were individuals who had intended to train on civilian aircraft, that the State Department had received information that people were trying to infiltrate. The CIA had received information that Al-Qaeda wanted to launch a major attack sometime in the fall. So all the pieces were out there, but no one was there to put it all together. At the start of the Iraq War, we had the same situation, and that problem had not been remedied yet. Now, not only did it create the problem of not being able to kind of collate all of the intelligence, kind of analyze it safely, but it created a problem on the part of decision makers who, when, for example, one of the 15 would come up and offer, let's say, a minority report and say, we disagree with that. The political decision makers then in turn could say, oh, well, these other organizations offer a counter to that and disagree. And this happened multiple times on the road to war in Iraq. For example, the case of the yellow cake in Niger and the alumina rods that were going to be part of the theoretical centrifuges. The Office of Intelligence and Research within the state, the Department of Energy's Intelligence and Counterintelligence Office revealed and said before the 2003 invasion that, hey, this is hogwash, this is all baloney, and the IAEA inspectors and the UN inspectors are correct. This information that is being brought in is not accurate. But the decision makers, because of the structure of the US system, were able to say, oh, well, that's not what the CIA is saying. Similarly, the case of the unmanned aerial vehicles that were theoretically going to spray biological agents across the US East Coast and Canada too, the CIA got it wrong and said, hey, yeah, this is a real threat. The agency that actually flies unmanned aerial vehicles and drones, the US Air Force Office of Intelligence, said, excuse me, but we do this for a business, and there's no way that this UAV that you are saying can perform that mission. It's really only could put a small payload in there of a camera, just not possible. And so there are multiple cases of this where the systematic problems created an inability to come to an accurate conclusion. Now, there are many other cases that we could talk about them. Another problem occurred in terms of human biases and human decision-making. And three biases kind of come to mind here. The availability heuristic, confirmation bias, and then closure bias. All hit the intelligence community in different components. One of them being the availability heuristic, which is, as humans, we're faced with a new situation, we tend to default to something that was similar before, okay, and a similar experience. Well, was there a similar experience before in Iraq? Yes, of course. It was 1990 and 1991, and the road to war there and the after effects. And so as some within the intelligence community said, hey, we think that, you know, that there are no WMDs, and that Saddam, for example, is, you know, not, you know, he's telling the truth, or Saddam is concealing things, but there are no WMDs. The availability heuristic came up and said, okay, well, what happened in 1990 and 91? Well, unfortunately, inspectors missed stuff. And then after the first Gulf War, it was revealed that Saddam's program was much more extensive than had been expected. The problem was that availability heuristic was completely wrong. And the programs had been completely shut down. And so rather than think logically, they fell back on what they knew. Another example in terms of like confirmation bias was on the issue of, you know, well, why is Saddam just, you know, why is he not kind of admitting, just kind of coming straight out, and as well as why is he, you know, kind of buffering some of the inspections? You know, why would Saddam, you know, not just come out straight and say, hey, I have no WMDs, it's all clear? The, you know, State Department's actual Office of Intelligence and Research got it correct, but the confirmation bias, which was many people in the intelligence community had thought, hey, you know, there is no way that Saddam would disarm because he lives in a dangerous neighborhood. Confirmation bias was there because that was what they thought they wanted, when in fact the Office of, you know, Intelligence and Research and State Department said, you know, Saddam doesn't want to admit it, because if he does admit it, it's for a domestic political audience as well as for his neighbors. He puts himself at risk. But confirmation bias created that problem. The closure bias is really tied in with 9/11, and just that notion that on the American side, for us south of the border, how traumatic it was. And it's just desire, it's this human desire to do something, even though, again, you know, being stupid, kind of the bull in the china shop, doing something should have meant think rationally, look at evidence, and then take action. But instead, closure bias pushed for quick action. And the national intelligence estimate that made the recommendations on Iraq was comprised over 3 weeks only. The last component, and I'll try to go very quickly on this, is the kind of semi-nefarious stuff. Was in the Bush administration, there have been many individuals who had wanted to go to war and saw that the Iraq was unfinished business to them. And they saw that, oh, they're a threat. Some of them, you know, saw Saddam in the way, and the Ba'ath Party in the way they saw the Nazis from World War II. And so they wanted, they had that confirmation bias to finish it out and finish the unfinished business. And so when intelligence would come in that would be contradictory, they would overrule it. And in fact, in the office of the Vice President Cheney's office, they actually stood up an Office of Special Plans, which would collect intelligence from these various agencies, raw, unfiltered intelligence that was not assessed for its, you know, effectiveness, reliability, and credibility, and took that intelligence and then picked the most inflammatory, the most extreme, kind of crazy stuff that had not been, you know, really vetted, and used that as a cudgel to say, hey, this is what's really going on. Oh, and Central Intelligence Agency, you, the people that missed the 9/11 attacks, you know, this is why you should be looking at this intelligence. And so they kind of twisted intelligence in a way that previously had not been done within the US system. The vice president's office is not traditionally part of the intelligence community, little sarcasm there, and created that situation. So, you know, all in all, that was kind of the kind of issues that led to the intelligence failure within the US decision to go to war.
Thank you very, very much. Well, that's really started us off well, and lots to think about. And just on the point about confirmation bias, that reminds me of one of the, and it was actually an American officer who participated in the UNSCOM, so the UN Special Commission looking at disarmament in Iraq after the first Gulf War. And the United States provided raw data through their spy plane, and it was analyzed by UNSCOM. So it was a multilateral analysis. And the conclusion was, and the American involved in this who passed this information on to some of us, confirmed this, or to the expert group, confirmed that the multilateral analysis was quite effective at reducing some of the biases, some of the national biases of various types. So something to think about. But I'll turn now, without any further ado, to Dr. Chris Kilford. Please, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, and Ambassador Mason and Hamid and Frank. It's really great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I think my bio should have probably said spends most of his time watching World Cup soccer. That would have been more accurate. But that aside, I thought I'd move quickly through some points. I'll move beyond Iraq. I'll mention Rumsfeld though, but I'll move beyond Iraq and talk about a few historical things, a little bit of background in one of my jobs also that I was doing a few years ago, and then focus a little bit on Canada and our national security policy. And of course, we've got the Indo-Pacific policy and what does that all mean for intelligence, because it looks like we're putting intelligence assets out in the world to do a better job. And so I want to talk about that as well. When Hamid proposed this topic, it made me think about history, because my PhD is in history, and so I'm always thinking about the past and what it means for what we're doing these days. And first thing that came to mind was Operation Mincemeat, which I'm sure everybody in the audience has heard of. Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, off his body floating towards the shore of Spain and being picked up, and the Germans gathering all of this intelligence about plans of the Allies to not attack Sicily, and of course causing Hitler to make troop movements, which paved the way for us to invade Sicily in 1943. So great, you know, they took the intelligence, misleading as it was, and ran with it. But on the other hand, there's a guy that I just love, codenamed Cicero. He was the valet to the British ambassador in Turkey in the Second World War. And he had access to the British ambassador's papers. I won't go into the details, but he was providing first-rate intelligence to the Germans. Actually, Franz von Papen, the former chancellor down the road, who was the ambassador to Turkey, and his staff were receiving top-notch intelligence, even about D-Day. And they were passing that on to Berlin. But Berlin had looked at this and said, this is too good to be true. So they had first-rate intelligence that they didn't act on. So it just points to how challenging it is at the policy level, whether you're in Berlin or Ottawa, to make decisions on the information that you are receiving. And then, of course, there's good old Donald Rumsfeld, 2002. You'll remember this when he said, you know, they're the known knowns, the things we know, and also some of the things we do not know, and there are the unknown unknowns and the things we don't. I mean, it went on, but it's actually very poetic if you watch it on YouTube. And there's a lot there. And there's probably a few known unknowns that are missing. But again, he was describing that world that policymakers do live in. And of course, I would imagine the Russians as well in the Kremlin around the run up to February were going through a similar thing. Perhaps there were people out there saying this isn't a good idea because a lot has changed on the ground in Ukraine. But of course, in authoritarian regimes, it's difficult to be a contrarian. And so in the end, the Russians got what they, I believe, deserved. Again, not acting on intelligence when it's perhaps sitting there right in front of you. And of course, our own trucker convoy. We can't forget our own trucker convoy in Ottawa. The lack of intelligence, the misreading of the situation, the not knowing what to do when faced with a situation like this. So we see this on a number of different levels. And I think looking back in time and perhaps more contemporary events is very helpful in shaping what we do. Now, I'm an air defense officer. I'm an artillery officer by background. I'm not an intelligence officer, but as I got a little older, I got thrust into some interesting positions. And I was the defense attaché, deputy defense attaché in Afghanistan for a year in 2009 to 2010. And then I ended up in Turkey as the defense attaché and had to keep an eye on the region. And of course, it was a very exciting time, I suppose, if you're in this line of work, because we were in the midst of the Arab Spring. And everything was falling apart, whether it was in Syria, Iraq, Iran, everything was going sideways. I also had to keep an eye on Turkmenistan. I was accredited to Azerbaijan and Georgia. All of those countries have their various issues. The first thing I learned is being on the ground is that I was largely on my own. There was no checklist to follow. You just did whatever you thought was right. If you were a hotspot like Ukraine, of course, then everybody has their eyes on you and there's lots of requests for information and for you to do this, that, and the other thing. But if you're not in a hotspot, then you do your best. I myself used open source intelligence, my travels and meetings with people, and I incorporated all of those into my reports. And I have to say, some of the best information that I had about what was happening in Syria in 2011 and 2012 was coming from other foreign attachés who were cross-accredited to Damascus, who were actually on the ground. And they, interestingly, were presenting an entirely different picture to what we were reading in the media and much of our intelligence reporting about the state of the Syrian armed forces. They would come back to me and say, you know, Chris, we've just been to Aleppo, we've been to Damascus. And these reports about the Syrian military being on its, just about finished are just not true. And so I would put that in my reports and send them back to Ottawa. I don't think anybody was really paying that much attention to them because we were all caught up with the fact that Saddam, in this case, sorry, not Saddam Hussein, but Bashar al-Assad would be gone in a few weeks and we wouldn't have to worry. And of course, that all proved to be not the case. I think what really helped me the most, though, on the ground was my PhD, surprisingly, because I didn't think it would ever be much use. But I had focused on the Ottoman Empire, civil military relations in the Ottoman Empire, in Turkey, and a few other places. And so when I was on the ground, it really helped me understand what was happening from a contemporary perspective, be it political, be it military, be it economic. It really didn't matter. I was so much happier to be in Turkey. It was purely by accident. No one had a master plan about this. And I think this speaks to a wider issue that we see in global affairs Canada these days, where this discussion about should you be a generalist or should you be an expertise and an expert with a certain expertise in the country or the region. And I would say generalists are always good to have, but I think we need to smarten up and start to have people out on the ground who actually know a little bit about the country and the region that they're going to. I was never sure who was reading my reports. Quite frankly, if I would call back to Ottawa to Global Affairs or our Department of National Defense, there would be a very young person there looking after 20 countries and not having visited Turkey or the region, Turkey or the region and so forth. And so you never were quite sure where your stuff was going. One of my reactions to that was to declassify practically everything. I started off thinking I was writing very top secret things and everybody would want to know, but I quickly learned that the best thing I could do was declassify everything and spread it around to all of my friends as much as I possibly could. And also to leverage the people in the embassy, because in Ankara, we had CSIS, we had the RCMP, we had a global security reporting officer, and so on. And it was building those relationships. But the intelligence piece itself, locally, it was more based on personal relationships. There was no requirement to talk to somebody. And I think that underpins a lot of what we do writ large. Now, coming back to Canada very briefly, we last reviewed our national security policy in 2004. I'm sure everybody listening knows that. And it was perhaps one of the first times we'd actually taken a serious look at national security policy. And you can see if you read it, how focused it is on 9/11. I mean, 9/11 is mentioned throughout the document. And I think it was us trying to show the Americans that we were seized of the issue and we're taking action. But on the other hand, though, it did lead to some very important things. We had the appointment of a Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, creation of a Cabinet Committee on Security and Public Health, and so on, the appointment of a National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister. So FinTrack, financial tracking, also the Integrated Threat Assessment Center, which exists today in CISG and is made up of a number of different departments. All of that flowed from that national security policy, as did Paul Martin's international policy statement. So it was very important. But the last time we took a serious look at this was 2004. I think we've had a wake-up call. It's sad that we have to have these wake-up calls. President Trump in the White House, China, of course, the situation in Ukraine. We've seemingly snapped out of a political malaise when it comes to looking after our interests. And I think Minister Jolie was very honest and frank when she recently remarked that we haven't been a reliable partner. We sometimes show up, as she said, and sometimes we leave. And we have this new Indo-Pacific policy, which interestingly does have that intelligence piece to it. It does say that we're going to put people out in our embassies in the Indo-Pacific that come with an expertise in what they're doing. And all I can say to that is, I have to say all of the Chinese military officers that I've worked with side by side in Ankara speak wonderful English and know what they're doing. And I don't think we have the same approach, and we need to get serious. And on the issue of getting serious, I think, look, I mean, people never have all the information they want. That's for sure. And we do need a wide range of skill sets if we're going to have half a chance of surviving the world that's out there. I think we need to expand, in fact, pull together some of our intelligence resources better than we do. A much larger integrated threat assessment center in Ottawa. That has to happen in my view. And I think why it has to happen is because I get really tired of us always talking about ourselves as a middle power in this country. How can we be a middle power when, for example, we have the 9th largest economy in the world? When on any given day we're the 11th or 12th largest defense spender in the world, as shocking as that may seem, because I can never figure out where the money goes. But nevertheless, we have a massive defense budget compared to many other countries. We're also practically the only country in the G7 world, as an example, and beyond, that's growing in population. By 2050, it's estimated we'll have 45 million people, and it will continue to grow. And so when we look around the world, if it's China, South Korea, Russia, Japan, any of the other countries in Europe, their populations are declining. We are becoming, if not now, are about to become a very important player. And I think along with that comes a need to know what's going on in the world and our own backyard. Thank you so much. And my apologies for, I was cognizant of the time and I wanted to get through a fair bit.
Well, thank you very much. And in fact, I would have given you a little more because we started a little later, we were a little bit behind. But we've got a few questions in the Q&A. I hope folks will add some more questions. Perhaps I might just start off the questions with one of my own, and this my question, it relates to a fairly hot topic, and although the question is now I think settled in Canada, and that's with respect to the ability of Huawei to be involved in Canada's 4 and 5G networks, which of course the decision has now been made that it cannot. Along with, that's the position of now. Well, New Zealand's position is a little more nuanced. They're doing it on a case by case, but the others, the rest have taken that position. And so my question is not really on the merits of that. My question is against that backdrop that the Five Eyes intelligence network, of course, and listeners will all be aware, the participants will all be aware that this is a network of USA, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And the four non-American members, I would argue, have a vested interest in keeping their powerful American counterparts happy to protect their access to the motherlode, American intelligence information. And so my question, I'm going to ask it two ways. Does this mean that our intelligence agency might not give sufficient weight to protecting Canada's capacity to act independently of the US, or perhaps, to put the question more provocatively, in a situation where CSIS is assessing the security risk to Canada of Huawei participation in our 5G network, bearing in mind that there has been, and independent Canadian intelligence experts have said there has been no evidence of a risk from Huawei, as opposed to a vulnerability of all 5G that needs to be addressed. But against that backdrop, does CSIS not have a direct conflict of interest when it comes to fairly evaluating the security risks to Canada of Huawei participation in our 5G network, given the American position with respect to this question? So that's really it. It doesn't have to be Huawei. It's where the overriding important partner has a clear position, an overriding, and it's not just a minor position. It's a clearly an important issue and an important position. And that really puts, it seems to me, Canadian, it becomes a very difficult position, it seems to me. And that's what I want to tease out from you. Your view on that is for Canadian or the other members, to put that aside, put that aspect aside and just evaluate the risk without that consideration. Okay, so perhaps Chris, you want to get in, and I very much want to hear if Frank wants to jump in as well. I've switched to first names now to.
I think Canadian departments are very honest with government, whether it's the Department of National Defense reflecting on UN missions, whether we should go, whether we shouldn't go, the dangers of and all that. I think they provide clear assessments. Perhaps one of the reasons why the government was so slow to react to Huawei was because CSIS was telling them there wasn't a big problem. And it seems that the whole Huawei piece has come about because of what's happening in the United States. And I was quite surprised at how emboldened our government was. I think it's clearly after the invasion of Ukraine to say Huawei out of our 5G, out of our 4G, and have all, companies have to remove 4G equipment by 2027. And so that was a step that I thought was even more bolder. And of course, along the way, we purchasing fighter jets, which we thought would be a can that was continually kicked down the road. And so I think CSIS and others provide good assessments. Departments will differ sometimes in their assessments, but in this case, to me, it's clear this was all about keeping an eye on Washington. I mean, all of our trade is, not all of it, but a large percentage, 70% or so, is heading that way. We have to watch out for our interests, and I think that is the underlying issue here. Is not interested in China's interests in this case, selling us equipment for our 5G networks and all that sort of thing. We're looking after our interests as it relates to the United States, which, I mean, any government would be foolish not to.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. And I'll turn to, just before turning to Frank, I'll just note, because you've mentioned 4G, Huawei is the supplier of 4G to Canada's north, essentially because it's the most robust system in dealing with the cold weather and because it's affordable. So there are real implications for Northern capacity, Northern resiliency from that decision. And I mentioned that just because it shows just the multi-dimensional aspect of this. But I'll stop talking and turn it to Frank, and then we'll go to, we've got a couple of questions in our chat, and more have been added.
So obviously this is a little, tougher for me to comment on as an American. I'm definitely not as familiar with the kind of internal defense establishment and intelligence establishment. I would throw out just as a observation from a Canadian officer that was presented to me who'd served in Somalia that I was interviewing around 2000, 2002. He commented to me that he was an attaché in DC, and he said, living in DC now is like living in Rome at the height of the Roman Empire. And I say that, a little mockingly. I'm not sure I would agree with the empire part, at least the Darth Vader-ish empire. But I would say certainly there's a gravitational pull. We're a giant. And, when you make steps even in one way, regardless, it creates seismic impacts. And I think that can, in the part of allies, put pressure on them to make decisions for sure, one way or the other. It's interesting, for example, that I would throw out the Australian perspective on Huawei. They're very, very concerned.
Thank you very much for that. Of course, it'll be interesting to see, the government in Australia has changed. The government at the time of the Huawei decision in Australia was, a strongly conservative government. Okay, but thank you for stick handling that question very well, given your position. Okay, I've got a question here from Don Scott, and the question is, and I think whoever wants to take it or both, it wasn't only the Bush administration who wanted a war with Iraq, but Israel was pushing hard as well. How much influence did Israel and the American friends of Israel with inside people like Richard Pearl have on the Bush administration's decision? And that reminds me, just the question, of course, there was the whole expat. There was that whole business of Iraqi expats in Washington providing, information of various levels of reliability as well. So, okay, we'll turn to Frank first and then go to Chris.
So, on the case of Israel, it's one that I kind of generally discount. I just don't see it as being a major driving force. Do I think maybe it had an impact? Yeah, but it's not going to be driving U.S. policy. And especially in the post 9/11 period, 2 years after the attacks, that is what is driving the train on a lot of U.S. policy. The events, they were just so traumatic to the American people and to the American soul that, that decisions, the behavior that would not normally occurred, I think. And so I definitely really discount that. I would, on your point, Ambassador Mason, about the Ahmed Shalabi, that, on the other hand, I would say that had a significant impact, because in many cases, there was a lot of information that was being funneled from him to that Office of Special Projects, which I will note I was incorrect. It is in the Defense Department, but it was funneling it to the Office of the Vice President. That Shalabi's, I'm going to use spies very vaguely here, okay? Sources. They were funneling a lot of that really inflammatory information that really was receiving low ratings in terms of reliability and credibility from within the formal intelligence community, but that they were being trusted more by political decision makers. I think that had a significant impact.
Oh, Ambassador, you're
Sorry,
muted.
I'm muted. Chris, do you want to add anything there?
Well, it's a little out of my area per se. I think though there are elements there. Obviously, back here in Canada, we have people, we have groups, lobbyists, and so diasporas that influence our government and the intelligence piece as well. It's just another aspect of what happens. And I think in the case of 9/11, of course, you saw Canada very quickly involved in Afghanistan, and one might say arguably indirectly in Iraq as well, even though we declared, obviously we weren't there, but we had people on the ground, if you like, with American and British units, Canadian military people on exchange. And I always like the example of one of our former chief of defense staffs, Walton Dutinchuk, who's, I think he's on the ground in Iraq in 2004, 2005, commanding some massive American, or at least deputy commanding some massive American organization. So again, it just speaks to this world that you live in capitals like Washington or Ankara or anywhere else, where you are making decisions based on your own interests, your best interests, looking to the future, regardless of what intelligence information might be there, telling you maybe to do something different. You realize that you need to get involved, and you're going to have to tough it out. So yeah, that's all I really have to say there.
Thank you very much. I mean, I feel duty bound to point out that there's a big difference between maintaining kind of military in place officers that were seconded for various reasons, maintaining them in place, and providing political support. And I think that was the key difference. But now I see there are questions lining up, and I've got to get to them. So Annabelle Zhu asks, what are the impact of disinformation campaigns on, this is a biggie, on Canadian strategic intelligence policies, and just, disinformation reminds us of the media, and that reminds me, of course, in the Iraq war, lead up to the Iraq war case, of the information that was fed to Judith Miller of the New York Times, which of course turned out to be erroneous. So that, that's been with us for a long time. But do you want to start, Chris, on that? What are the impact of disinformation campaigns on Canadian strategic intelligence policies? And I think we can get an American perspective too after.
Yeah, I suppose it can be very disruptive. I spend a lot of my time focused on Turkey now, and I've been just across Western Canada speaking about the war in Ukraine to various different audiences. And so on a daily basis, I'm consuming, just myself, a ton of information. And I have to try to parse through it and say, is this real? Is this true? And I bring all of the background that I have to the table as an artillery officer, as an air defense officer, someone that's very, very familiar with drones, my experience from an operational perspective, and then all of my academic background, and then a good book on history about Ukraine. But you bring it all to the table, and you need to figure out if what you're reading is true, partially true, completely false, exact. Where is it coming from? And that's just me. So what you need to find within the intelligence organizations in your country are people doing exactly the same thing. And I'm confident that they're there. They are there. They're probably scattered, I would imagine, in Ottawa. And we have them throughout the country in our various universities and think tanks and whatnot. And I think the tough thing is always pulling that expertise together to say, hey, here's a picture, here's what's ground truth, and it changes on a daily basis. So you've got to have enough people doing this particular job, and they have to have the language skills, and ideally they've lived there as well, because the people piece is so important. So this is how you tackle disinformation, and you're bombarded with it all the time. And if you don't have those pieces in place, you can be led down a certain path.
Frank, I see you're agreeing there. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I agree very much with Chris. I would throw out that, on the US side with disinformation, to me, there's two components of it. There's domestic and then there's international. And domestically, some administrations, and in many cases, it's almost just the way the game is played in Washington, where either a politician or even an agency will leak something to the press in order to try to achieve a policy objective. It's part of the game, unfortunately. And some of that is much more heavy-handed than others. To be transparent, in my opinion, the Bush administration and the Trump administration played that much more heavy-handed than other US administrations. But there's also an international component of it. And for example, in the US right now, there are debates. We now have 17 members of the intelligence community, up to from the Iraq War, road to war period. We're now having discussions on adding a new intelligence agency, an open source intelligence agency, because open source intelligence has become so powerful and strong and capable. In Ukraine, much of the information that is coming out, the counts of tanks and equipment destroyed, the frontline traces, all of that is open source, is amazing. Yet at the same time, as Chris indicated, there are challenges in that there are active efforts on all sides to try to provide disinformation in that. And so kind of sifting through that is also, it's an international challenge as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Okay, well, the next question from Don Scott. I'll present it as written. Where was CSIS during our anti-vaxxer trucker convoys and occupations? Were they spending their time on peace demonstrators and defund the police activists? What is their utility? Okay, well, I guess, Chris, you're up on that one.
Well, I really don't know where they were. I have no idea. They were probably providing some background information on who was coming, who was going, where they were coming from, maybe where some of the funding was coming from. They would have been, for the trucker protests, they would have been playing a role, painting a picture. The trucker protest, I think that, the trucker protest is an example for me where Canadians often prepare for the best outcomes and we don't prepare for the worst outcomes. We need to do more of that, so that when we're faced with situations, of course, then again, you don't want to be running around in your own country and seeing some of the things that we see in authoritarian regimes either. So again, it's a balancing act. At the end of the day, I mean, there's a fine line between what we see in China, let's say, and maybe what could have happened in Ottawa. One could argue that at the end of the day, we actually navigated that crisis quite well. But as to where CSIS was, I'm sure they were in the background. They were feeding into an overall picture. But listen, we're not a country where if CSIS gets a little bit of intelligence information about you, that you're suddenly snapped off the street and never seen again. So that comes part and parcel with living in a democracy.
Thank you for that. For those that have watched, and I haven't been able to watch in detail, the hearings, the commission hearings, the review, because that's one of the things, of course, that the Emergencies Act requires, is that, a couple of detailed reviews. But an interesting thing that's come up out of that is there seems to be a fair amount of evidence that the Ontario Provincial Police were actually providing quite detailed intelligence assessments, which didn't appear to get acted on. And since part of what we're looking at here is process, some folks with sort of strong government bureaucratic experience have wondered whether, on a very practical level, the problem was they were long briefings and they didn't have kind of heads up, here's the core message, they're going to stay a long time, they're prepared, blah, blah. I mean, the sort of key messages were kind of buried in these, what were actually excellent reports. So anyway, I offer that as one of the interesting things that I think has come out of the hearings. And the next question is from Jeffrey Allen. Is there any added value for Canada establishing a foreign intelligence agency to complement the work of CSIS? What would be the advantages and disadvantages of such a policy decision? That's, it's getting away a bit from our topic. So on
yeah.
But anyway, go ahead.
I can perhaps comment on that.
Please.
Are there advantages? Yes. I mean, obviously, if you've got more people overseas gathering information and bringing it back to Ottawa, perhaps working in some gray areas that maybe we don't want to get involved with, that's a potential disadvantage. But when I look at the Canadian situation myself, I mean, I have experience working in 2 embassies and always alongside CSIS officers who were on foreign soil, if you like, and working very closely. I think of Ankara, where our CSIS team was working very closely with the Turkish authorities when it came to issues like the movement of ISIS folks, or drug smuggling, or human trafficking, all of these things, keeping an eye on that. And also in Afghanistan too, when things were quite hot. So I think, and when I think of this, communications and security establishment and others, we have many of our intelligence organizations, D&D included, who are out there acting, if you like, as an informal foreign intelligence agency. Would you need, as Frank has pointed out, yet another agency to be gathering information? I think you would really have to ask yourself, why are you doing this? What is missing from what you are currently doing? Now, if you can answer that question, then fair enough. But if you can't, then maybe you want to just work with what you have, because I think adding new layers of intelligence folks just complicates matters at the end of the day.
Thank you for that. I guess before turning to Frank, I guess I'd say I'd add to that comment you made, your question that you've put, what is missing from what is currently being done? And if something's identified as missing, is it necessary to create another separate agency in order to do that, as opposed to, changing the mandate, broadening the mandate, refining the mandate of the existing ones? But I'll turn to Frank and for his comments.
Yeah, this one a little more reluctant to provide an answer. Obviously, I'm not super familiar with the Canada's intelligence community. It's done a very practical level, that as Chris pointed out, there's the danger of becoming like the US system, where we have this very disparate, conglomerate kind of, constellation of different organizations in many ways that fight with one another, that create turf battles, that create some dysfunctionality, rather than something that's very focused. At the same point, like on the US side, frankly, we are not doing a good job on what is having changed on open source intelligence. And in many ways, intelligence officers in the US, look down their noses at open source intelligence and know, oh, it's not classified, it's not top secret or secret. And in many cases, the intelligence that is there it is better than the secret, and in many cases, top secret level stuff that is being generated. And it is more timely, and it's so, that's the core of the question. Like Chris said, can it fix something that can't be fixed within the internal system already?
And if I could just jump back in there, I found myself, as limited as my experiences have been, that the highly classified intelligence that I might be privy to was just not, I thought I might have, well, look, I mean, I don't want to just dismiss everything, but I often felt like I was reading The Economist or a Time magazine article. Whereas if I went to the open source material where people were gathering real data and putting it up, and there was some great people working on this during the during the Arab Spring and what was happening in Syria. Boy, it was amazing what was just right there on my own computer. Ambassador, you're muted again.
Twice, that's unforgivable. That is really unforgivable. Okay, well, I'm conscious of the time, but we've got a really good question from Mark Hubert for both of the speakers. She's asking me too, but I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to go to the speakers. What are two measures each that you would recommend to minimize the gap between intelligence that is as complete and timely as possible and effective policy decision making? I'll turn to Chris first, and then Frank.
So I feel like I'm back at university and I'm having an exam right now. What two measures? Oh, I guess because it's such a huge subject, I just can't think of two little things that one could do to somehow make it all better. I have to be frank. I don't know, because quite often you can have great stuff, and as Ambassador Mason said, you're delivering the best intelligence you can to the decision makers, but you're not doing it well enough, and they're not understanding what it is you're trying to tell them. And how do you remedy that? Now, I've got friends back here who always say, oh, I wish those politicians were better educated about world affairs, because people come into these roles as key decision makers from all sorts of different backgrounds. They're not all experts on Ukrainian foreign policy. So how you simple answer is you can't fix everything or anything at times, as much as you would like to. I think, as I go back to my comments, that we need to think we need to think of ourselves as a serious country, and put in place a large enough apparatus in Ottawa to gather the intelligence that is out there, open source and others, and bring in the multicultural expertise that our country offers, and be able to present. That was one thing I would do then. So look, I have one thing, and present decision makers with what they need to. Not with what they need to hear. I suppose we do some good things at the local level. I think about my work at the Canadian Forces College, the National Security Program, which brings together senior military officers with their counterparts in other government departments to spend a year studying international issues. I think that's incredibly helpful as well. But I think that's about the best I can do right now.
Thank you very much. Well, conscious of the time, I guess Frank, what I'll ask you to do, perhaps you can, because the next part of this is that you each have closing comments, 5 minutes of closing comments that you can make, and if you want to begin with or add in to that any suggestions you might have from the question about how trying to close that gap between good intelligence, timely intelligence on the one hand, and effective policy and decision making on the other. If you want to fold that in or not, it's up to you in your closing comments. I think that's the way I'll handle it, if you'll allow me, Frank.
Yeah, so I will, if it's okay to take that opportunity, I'll take it. Because I do think it's a really important question, like how do we improve? I mean, that's ultimately, what we should try to take away from kind of this Iraq debacle. And so one thing I would throw out, there's two things that I think that could be done to improve, and one big, one small. And the big one is something that has even changed since the 2003 invasion and the road to war. And the intelligence world, there is an intelligence in revolution affairs going on. And in many ways, at least on the US side, a lot of the intelligence community is still centered on either kind of an industrial age intelligence or even early information age intelligence, but it is not really like reflecting all of the technological changes that have occurred with the fourth industrial revolution or the information revolution. And just to, I mean, this is something that we talked about for like an entire 60-minute period. But just to give like some overviews, we talked a little bit about open source intelligence. It's really huge. Another major component of it is the change in signals intelligence, which is all computers now. And then another component of it is just that, how do the intelligence agencies adapt to it? Because so much with all the information, minimal privacy, facial recognition and the global surveillance regime, you can't hide anywhere. It's almost impossible. The old days of traveling somewhere on a false passport and a false identity, that's just fantasy. It's a James Bond fantasy that just, is out the window. In many cases in the US intelligence community, sorry, there are many traditionalists that have not made that leap yet. And so I think there needs to be a hard look at how fast technology is changing the business of intelligence, analysis, counterintelligence, espionage, all of the various ints. That's the big thing that needs to be looked at. The small change, that I would throw out, I do think, and this is something that the intelligence communities on the US side, have been a little reluctant to, and that's kind of the inclusion of a minority report. And a little bit of that is space constraints, and I understand that. I mean, having dealt with decision makers frequently, they're reading your report as they're transiting from one meeting to another. Your 2-page report, they read the first paragraph, they don't have time to read anything more. It's a dysfunctionality in the system to try to allow more time to make decisions. But including in there the minority report of, okay, this is what we think is going on, but here is what the exceptions to the majority feel is going on. So that way, more informed decision makers and their staffs, who are the ones who theoretically would have time to read it, will at least have that information, and be armed with it. Because, sadly, in the case of Iraq, I think it was a foregone conclusion with the Bush administration. But, we want to prevent other administrations that are more open to information, conflicting information, from making similar mistakes that we made in Iraq. And again, some of that was simply just because of, Clausewitz talks about a component of war being passion. And that was certainly the case after September 11th. But having that minority report, having all that information can help kind of make a more informed decision rather than just a passionate decision. And I don't know whether it may be best to just leave it at that as my closing remarks. I think I'm probably pretty close to 5 minutes because I tend to talk too much. Sorry for everyone, but maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you very much, and we're absolutely not sorry at all. And before turning to Chris, I want to say just how glad I am that the open source is getting attention, which is of course part of this revolution as well. And I just want to harken back, back in 1991, when I was the head of the Canadian delegation to the Biological and Toxin Weapons Review Conference. And Canada was a big champion of confidence building measures, sharing of information among scientists and working in high containment labs, or who was studying in what program in university, all of this kind of information sharing. And to cut to the chase, my briefing before going was based on open source, completely based on open source. And my American counterpart refused to believe for the entire conference that I could possibly know what I knew based on open source information. So, we were in there early, and I hope we still have that fervent belief. But with that, I will turn to Chris for his closing, for the final word before the thank yous are made.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, Frank mentioned James Bond, and I remember how excited I was when I arrived in Ankara I was given a visitor's pass. It was my first day on the job, and the visitor's pass number was 007. So yes, small things for make you happy. But I do have a little bit of a story, and it was in 2012. I had come back to Canada. I'd been asked to come back to Canada to speak to folks about what was happening in Syria. And so when I arrived in Ottawa, the folks in our intelligence organization asked if I would be okay with a video conference with analysts in the Pentagon, so I could speak about what's happening in Turkey, what's happening in Syria, my sort of assessment. And I was, of course, a little bit nervous about doing that, but that's okay. And the day came and I was hustled into the room, and they said to me, well, actually now we've got about 6 or 7 intelligence agencies who will be listening to what you have to say. And so you may have gathered I do like to talk. And so I did what I had to do and said my piece, and everybody was happy, and there were lots of questions. I didn't think much of it. And then I returned back to Ankara, and a few days passed and I got a phone call from the American embassy. And it was my American counterpart. And there were 8 of those guys, defense attaches, and 1 of me. And my colleague said to me, "What did you just do? What were you doing briefing all of these guys in America, in Washington? Because we're being told, why can't you guys provide what that Canadian is providing to us?" And this is a true story. And so I don't know if it was a foreigner providing a foreign perspective, let's say, or people weren't getting this. I don't know. I mean, maybe because, as Frank said, no one's reading actually what you're producing. And it's only when they sit down with this interesting foreigner for half an hour that they walk away going, well, I never knew that. And so this speaks, I think, volumes to some of the challenges that you face in the intelligence world, that there's lots going on and people often don't have the time. And there you go. And the last piece I would end on is, I think, the importance of history. Because I always think to myself that if I was to gather an intelligence organization around me, I'd want probably half of it to be made up of historians. Because I think in our country in particular, and we need to pay more attention to this, because of course we come from everywhere, people do. We have this failure to understand other places, other peoples, other countries. I reflect back to Afghanistan when I tumbled into my office and my political colleagues next door had these huge, the whole wall was covered with faces of Afghan leaders, and they were trying to map tribal relationships. And I thought to myself, and I've said this before, imagine if you brought 50 Afghans who don't speak English to Canada, and put them in Toronto, and you said you've got a couple of days to figure out the power relationships in this city and who's doing what to whom. I mean, what chance would they stand? And yet there we were trying to do it elsewhere. So I think there has to be a realization that we often don't know a lot about the places we're working in, and we need to be humble in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. So I know there are thank yous to come, but as the moderator, I want to say what an extraordinary privilege and pleasure it's been to moderate this discussion. And I'm left with 2 important words: modesty and minority. And I'll turn now to Valerie Keyes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Mason, and a special thanks to Chris and to Frank for a very stimulating and interesting discussion. I will build on what Ambassador Mason has just said. The words that leap out for me are informed decision-making and open source. And having come from a background that worked on both sides of the fence, both on the intelligence side and in the policy-making side, I couldn't agree more on both of those positions and those ideas. And it's very interesting to see how those are interpreted. And Frank's pointing out the myriad of defense or intelligence organizations in Washington, and the emphasis on putting in the full information, not just the obvious information, but the full information to include contrary views with minority report or additional information. And Chris, your emphasis on the background and on knowing with whom you're speaking and knowing the culture and everything else that goes on with making those decisions, and as policy makers and putting the policies up to decision makers, it's sometimes very hard to get that balance between the information that's available. And I couldn't agree more with Frank over the issues of biases. You know, the confirmation biases. I know as a junior policy analyst briefing the then newly appointed Prime Minister Jean Chrétien in whenever it was, 91, 94, whatever year it was, it's a long time ago anyway. And, you know, knowing that he disliked foreign affairs, he disliked defense matters. And there was I trying to persuade him what a great idea it was to help support bombings in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. And changing his mind was obviously going to be an impossible task. But those are the challenges that I think everybody in both sides, in the intelligence world and in the policy-making world, putting those ideas together. And I think Chris and Frank, you've done an excellent job of putting all those issues out on the table. And thank you both very much for your time this evening and doing this discussion, and to Ambassador Mason for a very capable and able, as always, moderating of the panel, and appreciate all your input into the discussion as well. And it's as a final point, if I am speaking directly to our audience and our participants, as opposed to those in the know sitting on the screen now, if you are not a member of the CIC, I highly recommend that you do join the CIC, and then you can participate more and more often in these sorts of discussion. And I also want to say a thank you to my colleague Hamid for suggesting that our two study groups collaborate on this sort of function, and I look forward to doing it again in the future. So to everybody, to our participants, thank you for being with us. To Lucas, thank you for helping us on the technical side. Hamid and I are not exactly what we might call technical experts. And to our speakers and moderator, and thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you. Good night. Good night, everyone.